Welcome to Cross Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from U.S. tax reform to the OECD's latest developments. I'm Doug McConey, PwC's U.S. International Tax Services leader. You can find me on Twitter at XBorderTax. On this week's episode of Cross Border Tax Talks, we're in our D.C. studio, where I'm honored to be joined by Mark Boyer. Mark is a partner in our Washington National Tax Services practice, specializing in mergers and acquisitions with a heavy emphasis on cross-border deals. Mark will be retiring in June of 2020. During his over 36-year career in tax, Mark has had roles including starting his career as an attorney advisor for the IRS, national and global leader of PwC's M&A tax practice, member of PwC's U.S. and Global Board of Directors, and adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Law Center. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Doug. Happy to be here.
Well, Mark, you came out of the IRS and joined PwC back in 1988. You have been an amazing mentor and friend to me over the course of my entire career. We had the first real opportunity to work on a really big deal back in 2004. And so one of the things that I'm very interested, particularly with having a number of retired partners on the podcast over the last, several months,
right,
is I'm fascinated about what it was like practicing tax back in the 80s. And so you're a deal guy, M&A guy. One of the things that I learned in law school, I don't mean to keep dating you, but I'm going to.
Right.
One of the things that we spent a lot of time learning in law school was the repeal of general utilities. Right. And what a transformation that was back in 87 when the new law came. And for some of our newer practitioners that maybe not as familiar with that, generally what that said is that when corporations distribute property to their shareholders, it was subject to tax. And that was a major change in just how we thought about corporate taxations, and particularly distributions to the shareholders, and really planning deals and deal structuring. So what was it like back then when you were coming out and that major change that had taken place back in the 80s? Because we're going to obviously move to the TCJA very quickly, but I'm interested to know kind of what was that like? What were some of the major changes, and how did that really change the practice?
Yeah, so, I was a pretty young attorney back then. I mean, that was 1986 was the, official kind of repeal of general utilities. I think it was May of 86. So I'd been at IRS Chief Counsel, started in 84, and, really began to understand, subchapter C concepts, if you will, pre-general utilities repeal. And, the planning out there, from a deal perspective, was all about taking advantage of general utilities and making sure that you didn't pay tax at the corporate level with regard to distribution, transfers of corporate assets, mm-hmm. right? Now, from 82, let's say, to 86, there were some provisions added, certain types of transactions where corporations would recognize gain on their assets. But 86 sort of, no longer were you allowed to dispose of assets without paying tax on the gain in the assets. And it was such a huge change that there was quite a bit of transitional relief provided to different sized companies, sub-S companies, et cetera. So, a lot of the deal planning was around stepping up the basis. I mean, when you're given an opportunity, when there's
Sure.
transition relief, right? A lot of the deal structuring was, how do I take advantage of that transitional relief? That was spread out over probably, 3 years. So from 86 to 89, a lot of the planning was, is there still an opportunity to step up the basis of corporate assets? Without paying tax.
That was just a given, right?
Right.
Presumably back in the day.
Well, it was, and I moved from chief counsel to PwC in 88. There was still a lot of companies we were consulting with that were, living in the old world, right? Hey, I could do this transaction and not pay any tax on my assets. And we're like, well, it's not quite that easy anymore.
Right.
And, by 89, I would say Congress did a really good job, and the IRS through regulations, et cetera, did a really good job sort of enforcing that new principle that corporations would not be able to dispose of their assets without recognizing gain and then paying the appropriate level of tax on that gain. With the exception of, what grew out of that were the so-called mirror transactions. Mm-hmm. A lot of variations on those types of transactions. They generally stood for the principle, or there were opportunities in planning to achieve a step up in the basis of stock. And the question was, if you're selling stock out of a corporate group, is it appropriate under the repeal of general utilities? Is it appropriate to tax stock gains, or should you be allowed to step up the basis of stock to essentially break up a company? And those transactions started proliferating around 1987 into the early 90s. There were some notices issued in certain specific structures that said no, this isn't appropriate. There was a lot of planning around the consolidated return provisions. Sure. And then there become legislative changes. So, the fact that you can't apply the aggregation rule, under for gain on liquidations in a consolidated group is just one example of how the law changed to make it clear that stock's an asset, and if it's held by a corporation, it's inappropriate to step up the basis to avoid paying tax on the underlying assets. The opposite point of view is the gain is still present in those underlying assets. So, why tax the stock and the corporate assets? So there's an argument that that's double taxation, right?
Yeah, so I see a lot of analogies to just the major change that we've gone through now since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and obviously really has changed the paradigm for U.S. multinationals, for financial buyers, and the major changes that we've had that we spent a lot of time in the cross-border tax talks talking about 163J, so our interest limitation, the base erosion and anti-abuse tax, which we'll get into, can really create a whipsaw. GILTI, obviously, we've talked about ad nauseum. And there's a lot of transition that's now taking place with these rules where we're still waiting for regulations. And so I want to spend most of our time talking about structuring, but did want to touch on diligence because that's obviously such an important issue for our clients, whether it's a financial buyer, whether it's a strategic buyer, U.S. foreign multinational corporate buyer that plans to hold the assets. But what are some of the things that you've seen post TCJA that companies should or need to be focusing on as part of diligence, and particularly, some of the gap issues? And I say the gap issues, hey, we've got a statute, we're not exactly sure how to apply it,
right?
And then we have regulations, and frankly, we are already today we've seen regulations that are applying retroactively to transactions that we didn't know those particular transactions were going to be subject, for example, to the extraordinary disposition regulations.
Right.
What are some of the other things, or what are some of the things that companies should be mindful of, or buyers should be mindful of in a deal?
Yeah, I think the it has changed a lot with TCJA, the diligence process as well, and the overall deals process, and we'll get into the structuring side of it in a few minutes. But from a diligence perspective, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. Typically, when you're doing diligence, you first define the period of the diligence, and generally, you go back maybe 5 years. I mean, that's all defined in sort of the deal perimeter, if you will, when you get started on the transaction. I think what's interesting now is sort of development at the IRS and how they're looking at audits, right? They're really investing heavily in training their agents up around TCJA and encouraging them to get more current and to settle on older issues. So, right now, I think if I'm doing diligence on behalf of a client, let's say it's a financial buyer that's buying a company, I would be very, very focused on that, 2017, maybe going back to 2016 through 2019 time period, because I think that's where that company is likely to get the most attention from an audit perspective, just given where the IRS is and sort of their exam process. And then, as you point out, I mean, there were a lot of internal transactional planning going on in anticipation of TCJA. Now, it wasn't easy because, as you recall, we had a House version that was quite different than the Senate version and the final version that we got. But, throughout the process, there was always some discussion of a toll charge. So there were a lot of internal transactions to that might affect your earnings and profits. Sure. Might affect your bases. The the data points that would come into the potential toll charge that would be applied. So, that's going to be an area that will be subject to exam.
Sure.
And so, on diligence, you're really trying to identify any risks in the target entity that you're acquiring, and so you want to identify those tax risks. And then, a lot of companies, especially outside the U.S., have tax years that are not necessarily calendar years, right? And so that created effective date opportunities, if you will, as various provisions of TCJA sort of came into effect at different times. Now, I think Treasury is, fully aware of some of those opportunities, has done a good job identifying them. You're right. There's been retroactive regulations that impact some of that prior planning. So, as part of the diligence process, just making sure you've got a handle on what the positions are. Are they still sustainable? Have they properly reserved? Those type of things. It's a big part of the diligence process.
Yeah, the toll charge, the Section 965, I know just a lot of taxpayers want to have that in the rearview mirror.
Right.
So, and unfortunately, the service, it appears is kind of is staffing up and spending a lot of time, understandably, on that provision. And so, the diligence process associated with 965, I think, is very important. One of the other things that I've seen is the base erosion and anti-abuse tax.
Right.
And obviously more kind of international specific, but there are a number of taxpayers, and this might be more in the strategic perspective certainly than for the financial buyers, but could certainly be relevant for the financial buyers. But companies that are trying to stay below the 3% threshold as far as not getting into the beat.
Right.
And one of the things that I've advised that companies need to be very mindful that if they're doing an acquisition and that target has base erosion and anti-abuse tax type payments, right, that could then tip the numbers such that they are now above the safe harbor. The implications of ending up in the beat, which we've talked about a lot, can be catastrophic because companies that have a big GILTI inclusion obviously do not get foreign tax credits.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that on a number of the deals that I've been looking at that we're very focused on for a company that thinks they're well below or below the safe harbor, and oftentimes they're not necessarily well below the safe harbor, they're very below the safe harbor. And that's one of the things that obviously that was not relevant pre-TCJA, just something we just really didn't spend a lot of time on.
Right.
And something that I think could be a significant whipsaw on making sure that companies understand when they're looking at those targets how it implicates their portfolio or their positions and attributes, I should say, going forward. So let's move to a little bit more some deal structuring.
Okay.
Because the paradigm has really changed for a number of reasons. Obviously, we have 163J, which is the interest expense limitation. So, I think that probably U.S. multinationals, and maybe we start with the strategic buyers, generally maybe took for granted, or we just, like, if you borrowed in the U.S., you could get interest deductions in the U.S.
Right.
Now it doesn't work like that. We've got the 163J limitation. We now have what I affectionately refer to as our worldwide system of taxation, which is GILTI, but I appreciate that some call that a minimum tax.
Right.
But obviously, GILTI now, every CFC, every controlled foreign corporation now impacts taxable income.
Right.
And so we've got the Section 250 deduction, but that Section 250 deduction only applies if the company is a U.S. taxpayer. So, if you're in an NOL position, your GILTI is effectively subject to tax at 21% because it's soaking up the NOL attributes. But that's really just a couple. So, how do you advise, and there's a lot to unpack here, but, what are some of the key things when you're talking to a client post-TCJA from a structuring perspective that they should be focused on?
Yeah, it is challenging, and when you think of what we were previously talking about, the repeal of general utilities being the last major tax act, and sort of by 1990, well understood what the rules were. You had from 1990 to essentially 2017. Right, of rules that people understood how they would apply in the context of deals.
Right.
So, there were playbooks that were developed, and a lot of our strategic, corporate acquirers kind of understood. If you're looking at a foreign target, you want to make the 330 AG election. bring it into your group, right? Step up the basis of the assets before they come into your structure. If you're doing a sale of foreign entities, for example, you want to sell assets because there's no current U.S. tax associated with that asset sale out of your controlled foreign corporations, right? Until you distributed, the money. And if you were going to reinvest it offshore, you just basically could do that free of tax.
Free of tax in the U.S., obviously.
Right.
Still had to think about the foreign tax, but I mean, a lot of companies, we've talked a lot about this on the cross-border tax talks, where you have holding companies and participation exemptions.
Right.
And so the check and sell transaction, right, was a way to manage your U.S. tax. You'd create a pile of E&P, but for 17 years, it was so what?
Absolutely. Right? And so there was a playbook that was sort of well understood. And so going into a deal, there was, and it was less dependent upon a number of different factors. It was really sort of, where is the target based? Is it foreign? Is it U.S.? Is there inside-outside basis differences if we're talking about, acquiring something out of the U.S., right? If it's part of the consolidated group, you could sell stock, but make a 338 H10 election, treat it as an asset sale, which you would typically do, right, if the inside-outside basis, meaning basis in assets, basis in stock, were the same.
Sure.
So, I guess what I'm trying to convey is that from an M&A perspective, you could go in and look at a deal, look at the parties, look at the structure, and pretty quickly say, this is the way you should do this deal, right? Absolutely. That's all changed. Right. And it's changed from the seller perspective. It's changed from the buyer perspective. As you mentioned, we now have this, and I call it a worldwide tax system as well. I don't know how you can't. I mean, you're paying tax on income generated offshore, right, every year, right. The GILTI tax. It happens to be subject to a different rate because of the 250 deduction than the U.S. tax. That brings in some interesting dynamics, right? Mm-hmm. When you think about, am I going to trigger gain outside the U.S. that would be subject to GILTI versus, or alternatively, gain in the U.S. at 21%? There's just some, basic rate arbitrage concepts that need to be considered in the context of any sort of deal. If you're the seller, you may have particular attributes that would be more beneficial in today's world. And you talked about some of the risks too associated with bringing a company that's subject to BEAT, into your group. Would that make you, subject to BEAT overall? Mm-hmm. And that's a changing dynamic. And do you need to plan for that? We also have FDII as well, and the concept of, do you apply it on a consolidated group, an affiliated group basis? That all sort of dictates where you might do your acquisition. So what I've noticed, a couple things. I mean, I've noticed that there's become more of an understanding in the deal world that these issues are complicated, mm-hmm. and require more either diligence or just more open dialogue between the buyer and the seller. At the end of the day, the deal partners benefit to the extent that a deal can be structured in a way that keeps the tax consequences, as minimal as possible, sure. Right? As legally possible. It's way more complicated to do that now, and there's a lot of different factors that come into play. So you really have to understand all the attributes. And when I'm talking about attributes, I mean it's your foreign tax credits, your NOLs, your capital losses, your basis in various entities. What's your expense apportionment ratio, and how might that change in the context of a deal? All these things have become more and more important because you've got to look at not only the tax costs associated with the deal, but going forward, how is that company how is their tax profile going to change? And you have to layer on top of that you mentioned, multinational companies. Mm-hmm. You've got law changes around the world. Right. And, we talk about, the law change here in the U.S. It's still fundamentally income tax, mm-hmm. right? It's still fundamentally, tax on income, whether income generated through operations or income generated through sales, okay? Whereas outside the U.S., there's all sorts of new tax theories, right? Right. The digital tax, it's just, and disclosure is increasing. So I would say, my 36 years of M&A, the concept that taxing authorities in, let's say, Europe would have an understanding of sort of a corporation's activities in another jurisdiction than their own. that Germany would understand what a company's doing in the Netherlands. When I first started, there was that just wasn't happening. Now, you have to just assume everything's transparent, right?
Oh,
and so that changes the dynamics, as well. So
yeah,
a lot of changes.
So let's unpack some of those.
Yeah,
things.
I know. I felt like I was rambling.
No, it's
bit,
great.
But,
I mean, there's
so much.
There's so much there. So I think one of the things that you had mentioned that the paradigm in the past was, well, you could check and sell if you're selling some foreign subsidiaries and avoid or defer U.S. tax. And obviously the toll charge ended up taxing all of this historic earnings and profits. Now we have GILTI. So what I'm seeing is a number of taxpayers, and particularly if they have a capital loss, for example, and imagine they want to sell a foreign subsidiary. Mm-hmm. So, generally the option would be, well, the U.S. could sell the foreign sub, mm-hmm. or if the foreign sub holds a bunch of disregarded entities or other corporations or whatever, you can do the Dover sort of, if you will, check and sell transaction. And historically, we would have always said, well, do the check and sell transaction because you don't have to pay the U.S. tax until you bring the income back. Obviously, that's not the case with GILTI anymore. So if you sell out of the U.S., the shares of the CFC, generally that's going to be subject to 21% tax. But if a company has a capital loss, then maybe they can use that capital loss against some of that gain. Now we still need to think about 1248 and deemed earnings and profits distribution that might be ordinary, but you got to model that out, right? And then as opposed to now, well, if you check and sell or sell those assets or those shares as assets for U.S. federal income tax purposes, well, that's a GILTI. But we have a number of taxpayers. In fact, I would say most of our clients and taxpayers, certainly not all, are in an excess credit position in the GILTI basket. So the fact is, if they can check and sell and create a bunch of GILTI, maybe some of that gain could be sheltered by some of those excess credits.
Right.
And those excess credits obviously don't carry forward in the GILTI basket. But the modeling, this is the theme of like everything from the TCJA. Because of all these different variables, modeling is just so critical to the entire process.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I failed to when I sort of gave my broad summary. But modeling is everything now. I kind of refer to it when I say there's all these different attributes that you need to take into account in your planning, but it's not just knowing that these attributes exist, but being able to model different scenarios, and some of it is surprising, as to what the results might be if you went ahead and triggered all your gain offshore, right? Depending upon what your basis in the stock is, and given the toll charge, and the PTEP associated with that and the basis increase in the hands of the U.S. shareholder of your controlled foreign corporations, you now have sort of potentially inside-outside basis disparities that can create some real opportunity when you look at, the tax rate for, gains offshore versus the tax rates onshore. So modeling is everything and data is everything. Right. And in order to really do that effectively, the two parties have to come together and be willing to share more. And I see that happening. I mean, that was not the norm previously because, again, the playbook was clear.
Right.
But now I think everybody kind of realizes if we're going to maximize this transaction from a cost perspective. What's this transaction going to cost us? Well, tax is one of the big ticket items in any transaction. So what can we do collectively to reduce that? And then we'll see how we share in that in the context of the deal.
Yeah, deals by nature sometimes feel adversarial.
Yes.
Right? Like it's us versus them, and we're trying to get a better result. And with the new system, it actually does require some teaming.
It does.
Which it seems at odds, right? With well, I'm trying to get the best deal. Well, for you to get the best deal, or for the buyer or the seller to get the best deal, the opposing party may need to help as part of the transaction for both parties to be in a better position.
Right.
And that's what's I think fundamentally different and interesting is like, hey, you have to, and then that requires you to show and explain what you're thinking, if you're a buyer or a seller, and it's interesting. And I think advisors as well as strategics and financial buyers we're all still kind of getting used to, all right, well, we got to open up the kimono and show and share and explain to explain to the opposing party why this is good. I say opposing party, but
yeah, see, there you go.
That's
that adversarial concept.
Right.
And kind of consistent with that Doug, is some of the other tools that we use, right? Because when you are starting to work together, but you're uncertain where it actually may land, you think of things like indemnifications. You think about things like contingent consideration, which is not available in every deal, right? If you're acquiring a corporation from its individual shareholders, generally an indemnification doesn't do you any good because you got the company and the shareholders are gone, right? So. I would tell you that what I find again very interesting in today's environment. There's the modeling, there's understanding, there's the planning, and it's all very exciting. But the uncertainty level is still pretty high, and so indemnifications, contingent consideration, and insurance, actual tax insurance, has become are tools that are used to try to protect the parties, given the uncertainty that's out there. And that's kind of a whole new area that we didn't have prior to TCJA.
Yeah, the other thing that I think has also really shifted some of the structuring is, as we had talked about 163J and the interest limitation. And then also kind of how that applies. We still don't have the 163J regs at the time that we're recording this. We've been told that they were imminent for a very long time. But at some point we're going to actually get those. And, applying 163J in the U.S. group, obviously you have to do that. How and if you apply 163J offshore, because the way interest rates have gone, the borrowing in the euro, the interest rates are at, I don't know if historic lows, but very, very low. And so a lot of taxpayers are questioning, well, do you borrow in the U.S.? Do you borrow in U.S. dollars? Do you borrow in euro? How do you manage the FX? Well, to manage the FX, maybe you just borrow offshore. But then if you're borrowing offshore, you don't get the U.S. deduction, obviously, but maybe you can try to borrow in a higher tax jurisdiction. Well, then you also need to think about how does 163J apply in the context of GILTI and whether that's deductible. And so the math has changed, I think, a lot. And obviously with 163J, you do have the indefinite carry forward, but where you put the debt and in what currency you put the debt has taken on even more importance. And I think that the historic, well, you get a 35% interest deduction, throw that into the model and call it a day, obviously is not the same anymore.
No, and Doug, you're absolutely right. And, kind of fortuitous in how we approach deals, with PwC, we started operating sort of on a platform basis, years ago. I mean, we'd always coordinate, especially in the diligence area, but, also structuring with some of our advisory and our assurance, brethren in the firm. But, we have developed this deals platform, and it's fortuitous because what we're seeing now is a broader audience for these discussions. Like, in the client meetings that I've been in over the last month, I would say probably 40% of those meetings, well, I would say probably 80% of those meetings has a discussion around Treasury, around, financing, and Treasury needs to be on board. I would say now 30 to 40%, whereas before it was zero. We actually have folks from the Treasury Department in the meeting, right? In the meeting, just like, some of the planning now, post-deal planning, right, which is a big part of it, post-deal integration, et cetera, getting those business people in the meeting as we talk about sustainable, supply chain structures and that type of thing as compared to, potentially debt push down. I mean, those dynamics are all changing, and so it's become a much broader audience that needs to be involved in these discussions around optimizing the deal.
Right.
And I'm seeing that really happen now, and I think on the tax side, TCJA really has driven a lot of that because it's just, again, those playbooks are gone. And so we're having to just reinvent them, if you will, and it's going to be way more complicated and less predictable than it used to be.
Yeah, the good old days of interest expense in the U.S. times 35, whatever your plus your state rate, times 38% through that, the deal model, they don't need to talk to the tax guys anymore.
Right.
And that's obviously changed.
Right.
Well, let's maybe conclude on for the financial buyers, right? So private equity, sovereigns. I know you play in that space a lot more than I do. So where you don't necessarily have a big U.S. multinational or U.S. group, what are some of the things that the financial buyers, and how has the TCJA changed as far as what they're thinking from a structuring perspective?
Well, let's just start with the differences between the two. For a strategic buyer, their view of it is we're adding on, right? And we should give a nod to divestitures, because actually I'm seeing a fair amount of divestitures as large corporations try to focus on their more strategic business lines, and or there are other businesses that they developed internally that have matured to the point that they can be separated, and they may have different capital requirements, et cetera. So we're seeing a lot of divestitures in the large multinational space as well. But as it relates to financial buyers, their focus is very much on cash tax, right? I mean, when it comes to taxes, their focus is on cash tax. And their focus is also on exit strategy. And, and generally they have a time horizon that they, would expect to hold. So they go and buy and they control. I mean, private equity is a controlling investment. Sovereign wealth, is developed over time. They used to invest through private equity. Then they went side by side with private equity, and I think that's still the more typical model. But sovereign wealth might, start doing some deals their own where they control, right?
Sure.
They control. So you're going in, you're acquiring the whole thing, you control it. You're very focused on cash flow, but you're also very focused on your exit strategy. So this modeling that you're doing is sort of a modeling, from acquisition through exit either through the capital markets, an IPO and sell into the capital markets, or a strategic acquirer coming in. And the time horizons, I think, my view of it is they have lengthened. So some of the planning that you might do from a tax perspective has come into play where they wouldn't consider it if you're really looking at a 3 to 5 year time horizon, like the value chain transformation, ideas to try to consolidate your operations, again, where it makes business sense.
Sure.
Consolidate your operations in a jurisdiction where you may have a more favorable tax rate. So, that planning is becoming, something that the financial buyers, will certainly consider. But their primary focus is on a good acquisition structure, typically a fresh start, right? Much easier to deal with taxes where you've gotten a step up on everything. So they're still very focused on, asset deals, stock deals with elections to step up the basis so they can kind of have a fresh start.
And the 338 election is what you're referring to.
Right,
and then obviously the seller needs to do the modeling to go back to our prior point of depending on how the seller holds that particular asset or that stock, what the consequences are of that 338 election, because that's generally going to be considered guilty, right, to the extent that it's a foreign subsidiary, obviously. Right,
but our private equity clients they're incredibly bright people, and they do pick up on the tax concepts pretty quickly. So they're also, the starting point is what are you paying in the deal? And so to the extent that you can minimize the overall tax or provide a benefit to the seller in the context of the structure, the private equity clients will listen to that. They're very willing to have conversations around the same planning that you might have for a strategic acquirer. So, I actually feel like there's a convergence going on. So between strategic and financial buyers, in that the modeling that we do and the analysis we do is applicable to both. Even though their focus is a bit different, one's long-term focused, it's more earnings per share focused, that's the strategic, and our financial buyers are more cash flow focused, and then having a proper exit. Let's not create a structure that I won't be able to explain when I do my roadshow to try to sell this thing, right?
Yeah, that's been, I think, just one of the really interesting things about TCJA is just how there has been really a confluence of all of these different issues and what I would consider maybe different subspecialties, whether it's between private equity or strategic, inbound and outbound, right? We used to have people that just would do one or the other.
Right.
And now with the new system, there's a lot of overlapping principles, right? Both in the deal space and then just historic international structuring. It's just like, well, all the people that would focus on inbound, well, 163J, BEAT, all of those provisions apply both to inbounds and outbounds. And so, and then modeling, which has been a big topic, and the cross-border stuff. It's really caused us as subspecialists or specialists within the tax practice to really have to work together and start to understand, what historically you could say, well, that was more of an inbound issue, or that was more of a financial buyer.
Right. Well, it's back to the past, right? Because, certainly when I started those 36 years ago, you had to understand the bigger picture, right? And again, coming out of the repeal of general utilities, it was you understand the bigger picture now. It's not just, do this structure this way and you avoid a corporate level tax. So, we kind of got there, and then as the world became more complex, and our corporate clients and our private equity clients became more complex, specialties started developing. But when you have a sea change like TCJA, the people that can really kind of bring it all together, can see it all and understand the opportunities as well as the pitfalls, that's when you're adding real value to your clients. And that's kind of where we are now. Unfortunately, we team so well together. It's working very well.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to end it, going back to the beginning of your career. Let me just say, Mark, thank you personally. You've been an amazing mentor. I've enjoyed working with you over the course of my 21-year career. You were one of the first M&A partners that I met when I came out of law school in '99, and I just want to thank you for everything that you've done for me. You've been an amazing mentor. You've taught me patience, amongst other things, and thank you for that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Doug. It's been a great experience working with you, and we have done some really great things together. I won't forget that.
It's been a fun ride.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross Border Tax Talks. Thanks again to Mark Boyer, retiring Washington National Tax Services partner in PwC's M&A tax practice. I'm Doug McConey, PwC's International Tax Services leader in the U.S. Stay tuned for more exciting editions of the Cross Border Tax Talks podcast.